Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Salud.
Cheers, guys.
L'chaim.
L'chaim.
To the release of a very interesting book written by our special guest, BJ Dichter.
Our producer.
And
One of
also
our
our
producers.
producers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Honking for Freedom, which is about the Freedom Convoy in Canada that rocked the world. It truly did rock the world. And so tell us about the origins, actually, because it started out being something that was sort of a small idea.
And then how you got involved. Just to give a chronology.
So there was initially a convoy in 2018. And so Tamara was a part of that convoy, and I had met her many years. She explained the backstory of what happened. And so that was 2018, went by sort of thing. And now 2022 comes up. People are very frustrated in Western Canada for a whole bunch of reasons. And the mandates and the data tracking app, that was the final draw, right? That the people who, like some of them I met there, their doctors would tell them, I don't think you should get the vaccine, but if I tell you that, I'm going to lose my license. So you do what you think is right, sort of thing. So it scared a lot of people. And these are people, they're cross-border truckers, and this was their livelihood. They didn't know what to do. So a lot of us, I mean, I'm vaccinated anyways, I'm not anti-vax.
When you say us, that's because you're not just a producer, you actually own a truck.
Yes, yeah. I also that was my side hustle during COVID to get away from the nonsense. Me and my brother, who's a police officer, that we would go get in our trucks and go to the States, so at least we could have a normal civilized dinner, sort of thing. Right. So, anyways, it was detrimental to people in the trucking industry. This was the last draw because there were many other things that led up to it. There was many other grievances, and Tamara Leach called me on. I mean, we usually talk every couple weeks, every month, we become friends over the years. And she called me up, she said, listen, we did this GoFundMe, we're doing another convoy like in 2018. I need somebody who can do media. And she said to me, I love these truckers, but I can't get some of them in front of the camera. I need somebody who knows, how to articulate a message. And I said, yeah, sure, I can, we'll do press releases and all that sort of stuff, because I was fed up too. I just had to use the Arrive can for the first time. Mm-hmm. And that's the story I told on Tucker Carlson. And I said, okay, I'm on board, and started working on messaging for the convoy.
Okay. But it was like she was contacting you because it was growing exponentially. She was like, they were getting way more donations. And ultimately, what was the amount of donations was like $10 million, right?
The total was 23 million and change.
And the support was coming from
all over the
world. Various like an array of segments of society, not just simply people who are truckers or more of this grassroots movement. There was people who were in law or who were accountants and others. So there was a broad base of support financially.
It was hedge fund managers, and it was working class people who work in shipping and receiving. It was everybody was on board.
It's across the board.
Yeah. Because the mandates, aside from just being the issue of compulsion or something like that, all of the shutdowns and everything, people were losing their livelihoods, their businesses.
That's right.
And there was no end in sight, for the longest time, I think. And so it was, I always thought when I was watching the convoy going and all the people coming out to cheer them on, that it was just the first time that people felt empowered to try and take back their lives again.
I got tens of thousands of messages, sometimes tens of thousands of messages a day. And I just couldn't keep up with the inflows. And I remember there was one day I got 2 identical messages from 2 women on Twitter. They were different accounts, different people. And they both told me, it was weird, the exact same, very similar stories. They both were single mothers. They both had 2 children. They had fallen into depression, lost their jobs, couldn't afford to feed their children, sort of thing. And they had been contemplating suicide. And the only thing that prevented them from committing suicide was, what do I do with my children? Yeah. And then they saw that there were this group of truckers that were going to stand up for us and say something and push back against what, in their opinion, had destroyed their lives. Mm-hmm. And they both said to me the same message, thank you for giving me hope.
Had they lost their jobs due to the lockdowns?
They didn't specify.
Okay.
They didn't specify.
I'm just curious what.
Yeah. Well, there was so much secondary damage done aside from the actual, travesty of the deaths that were caused by the pandemic.
Well,
because that was a real thing.
There's a massive contraction of the economy, derailment of many parts of our normal economic and social life. Plus, we saw how it impacted. Although there were deaths, there's also issues related to other health issues.
That's right.
Cessation of operations and testing and all sorts of other factors. Of course, I will say there was a lot of unknowns at that time. So, on both sides, I mean, there were people fearing what we didn't know, which was harming people, and we happen to know in this office people who are more elderly who passed away from
it
at
was
least
a serious
complications
issue
related to COVID. But there was a point at that time where people were quite desperate to say, is there an end in sight to this? And I felt an underlying tension that their liberty and their rights and their ability to make a living are being taken away.
Yeah, and I think, we hear this argument from both sides who are yelling at each other that, you're just afraid to take a vaccine. Everybody was making their decisions based on fear. People were afraid to get sick and die, or people are afraid to get sick and die from a vaccine. Which is accurate? Who knows, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's not COVID that crushed people's businesses. It's a government that compelled businesses to shut. We live in a liberal democracy where we should be able to make our own choices for ourselves. And if people wanted to stay home, they could stay home. And they shouldn't be punished for that.
Well, this brings me to one of the things that I think was really interesting about the way you guys conducted the protests and some of the decisions made by yourself and other leaders. And that had to do with the media coverage. So part of the problem is that, the media would all be sort of in lockstep, and this is the thing that we believe based on the science, and the next thing it'd be something different or whatever. It's like it was really difficult to know who to trust and who to believe, and then people were being silenced, and
the messaging on all ends was extremely challenging as a regular person trying to understand what the messaging was. It was difficult from all sides.
But when you started this protest, you actually made a decision to exclude the legacy media from your press conferences.
I put messages out that I banned the Toronto Star, I banned the CBC, I banned CTV, all of them from our press conferences intentionally. Because there's a couple of reasons. The first thing is, if we had a press conference and we brought in legacy media, what are they going to do? They're going to show up with one of their large camera crews, 2 or 3 people. You've been in media scrums before, you know how it works. They're going to take up a third of the floor space.
I almost got trampled by one once, actually.
Yeah, you told me that story. They're going to take up half the floor space, and what are they going to do? They're going to call us names, and they're not going to listen to us. And then they're not going to get any views. So why would I do that? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Had that already been going on when you made that decision, though?
No, I kind of knew ahead of time. The Toronto Star actually put out a couple of what I would say are defamatory cartoons, calling us all Nazis. That's where this all started. This started from the media, that messaging. And once I saw it, I thought, okay, you're done, you're out. And I just started building a list of pecking order, who's not available. And the other thing is, this was alternative media's time to shine, right? I've been in the space for a number of years. I know how it works. I know the players. I know the amount of penetration they have. And I figured, I put it out on a spreadsheet, and I figured we could achieve, if this goes well, 100 million views in the first week. That's what I was going for.
And there's an interesting situation in Canada right now in which there was media bailouts. So a lot of the legacy media, the mainstream media, have actually received government money. And this came up in a Munk debate, the infamous Munk debates, a very, very recent one, where they were talking about, the question was, can you trust the mainstream media? And for the proposition was Douglas Murray from the UK, a brilliant journalist, and Matt Taibbi, who used to work for Rolling Stone, I think, but he grew up in the mainstream media, and now he's an independent journalist on Substack. And they ended up persuading one of the biggest sways of the audience votes from the beginning to the end. They pulled them at the beginning and then they pulled them at the end. Yeah. And convinced people that the mainstream media, they're not saying, like I said, we're not saying don't read them. We're just saying don't trust them solely. Go and find other sources of information, right? So one of the major issues they talked about was the coverage of the convoy, the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah, and they meant. I think Douglas mentioned me, which is I've been a fan of his for years. He's a treasure of the United Kingdom, in my opinion. But it harkens back. Like my whole idea to do this, it's not like a new phenomenon, new understanding. I remember I had this conversation with Peter Kent several years ago, and I asked him in a private conversation, like, what happened to the media? When did it turn sour? And he said, I think it was when we started putting opinion pieces on the front page of the news. He said, that's when I knew we were going down the wrong direction. And this is just an evolution of that process. And that's why all you see is opinion journalism veiled as actual news, but there's no actual news behind it.
Well, I want to hear from Joseph, because you probably have a better understanding of how this process works. But a lot of the stuff and the way this went down, and this sort of comparison that was being made, I think at the time that Justin Trudeau was trying to claim this was like a January 6th event where the whole government was going to be overthrown. And so he brought in the Emergencies Act. And so what we've just seen completed, although we don't have any decisions yet, right, is an inquiry into the Emergency Act.
Yeah, so and I want to hear your sort of view of how that, because you were there for questioning. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as to what your view of the questioning was and the process. But look, I mean, it wasn't a January 6th event. There was no storming of Parliament. I remember saying something on Twitter about the aftermath with the charges against Marulich and the others, and some people getting quite irate against me, where I said, there's nothing wrong necessarily with listening. There's nothing wrong with creating a dialogue, because there is an undercurrent in Canada of people feeling that their rights have gone away. And then the Emergencies Act, what did that mean for Canadians as citizens when there's a protest going on? And whether you take the position that there was, honking at all hours, whether there was complete disruption in Ottawa. And I think the bridge situation did have an economic impact. But how do you feel about such a draconian measure, which is really reserved for quite extraordinary situations? I mean, it hasn't been enacted in 5 decades. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary circumstance. We were in an extraordinary situation at that time. But, I'm curious about the questioning, because at the core of what I want to get to is, was it fair questioning? Was there a general understanding about what it means to use such an incredible strong power, what it is about taking liberty and freedom away from people when that act is used?
I think freezing bank accounts was the most stunning of the actions.
That's part of it. I mean,
tell me, as somebody had all my accounts frozen, not just bank accounts, everything.
Had accounts frozen from not just people who were involved in organizing and participating, but also going after some donors, which is quite extraordinary, without really any sort of a judicious basis. There's no judicious basis, really, to do that. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, money is going to be returned. You can't do that. But these are extraordinary measures against citizens of your own country. So when you went to, this inquiry and there's questioning going on, was there a general sense of something was wrong with the way this was handled from the government side? And whether you view certain things were well done with the protest or not well done or harmful necessarily in some ways, I'm curious about how this was unfolding up there actually during questioning, because we're relying on media as to what was going on during this inquiry. I'd like to know your firsthand view.
So a couple of things. The first is, the overall interesting thing about the Emergency Measures Act is, from my point of view, as somebody who was there and saw that, that tenor, that vibe that I was trying to create with our messaging, that it was going to be a Grateful Dead concert. It was. This was Canada's Woodstock moment. It was absolutely amazing to be there, to see those truckers come from Quebec, and come up Parliament Hill and see supporters and truckers from Alberta and start to hug each other. And they had signs, Liberté and freedom, and they were all joking with each other and talking to each other through Google Translate. But finally, all that angst about the West versus Quebec, it was gone. That's political nonsense.
There was a leprechaun there too.
Yeah, well, he was actually, I wrote about him in my Substack,
I know,
djdichter.substack.com. Very fascinating story. He had everything frozen and his bank accounts all canceled. He didn't even have a truck on the premise. And it was a week after everybody left. So
Well, and the name Leprechaun comes from a charity that he was running.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
That it was like they called themselves the Leprechauns, and they were helping homeless people and things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. He was. I think he's one of the people involved in the soup kitchen we built.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, we got Canada's, for the Americans, Canada's version of martial law was enacted because there was a bunch of illegally parked trucks. That can't happen. That is turning us into a third world banana republic. And I've lived in third world banana republics, and not even they would do it. So the incompetency amongst our political class, I'm not going to point at individuals, is so awful at this point that they're dangerous. That's the first thing. But then into the commission itself.
Yeah.
I had, as you can imagine, many people with a lot of angst about the commission, what's happened when they found out that Justice Rouleau was a Liberal Party donor, and he was, he's appointed by the Liberal Party. And I put a lot of effort into calming people's nerves. Why? I think when you get to that level in your career, firstly, you're a justice. You're not some schmuck on the street, right? Mm-hmm. So,
and he was a very well respected justice when on the bench.
That's right.
I watched some of it, and he seemed like he was very even-handed.
He was also appointed by Paul Martin, and I happen to know there's a lot of friction in the Liberal Party amongst the Martin-era liberals and this progressive.
Yes.
So right away I said, you know what, don't jump to conclusions just yet. But at the same time, think about it this way, and I think you'll appreciate this, because I've learned this sort of stuff from you.
Okay.
Explain to me how it all works. You're a justice. You're at maybe getting close to the tail end of your career, because I think he's on the Court of Appeals, if I'm not mistaken. The commission is named after him. It's the first commission under this legislation. Are you really going to sacrifice your legacy for a political party? I don't think so.
No.
I really don't.
No.
And so I spent a lot of time trying to get people to realize that this is Justice Rouleau's legacy. I think he's going to be even-handed and fair. And I think he was. He gave a lot of leeway, gave me a little bit of leeway. He denied my application for standing. That's because some other people, you know how law is. There's a lot of games behind the scenes. So I submitted a late application. He denied that. But you know what? We found a loophole. It was called Law 59, where I could request that my lawyer lead me in a few questions if I don't feel my entire perspective was communicated. Yeah. And he granted that, and he granted leeway to a lot of people. So I think he was quite fair. I think the problem was the whole apparatus was very, very politicized by the lawyers who are supposed to be representing Freedom Corp, one who tried to attack me, who technically through a roundabout way is my lawyer as a Freedom Corp member, which was crazy.
There are a lot of agendas at play.
There were 20 people withstanding. One group withstanding was supposed to represent the truckers. The rest represented the government. And they did, they proved exactly what I thought was happening during the convoy. I explained, because my dad worked for the government. I know how they work. It's going to be a whole bunch of different administrations and different groups of people in policing and government, municipal, provincial, whatever. They're all going to be doing this. It's his fault, right? They're all going to be saying, oh, it's his, that's not our responsibility, that's not my job, and whatever, right? So I said to them during the conference, just let them figure out who needs to talk to us, and then we'll have a peaceful dialogue, and everything will figure something out. I'm sure the government's not evil, even if we disagree with some of their policies. Mm-hmm. They'll understand that there are massive grievances across the country, and as we discussed before, amongst hedge fund managers, bankers, lawyers, school teachers, and people who work on loading docks. Like, everybody is fed up, right? So they're not going to turn away from that.
But did you feel that when you were giving testimony, being asked questions, you were given the leeway to be heard?
That's a different question to say yes or no, and I'll tell you why.
It's important to me because I think, a commission like this has to give full opportunity to all parties to be heard.
I got a lot of criticism from people because a lot of people didn't understand my testimony. They didn't understand this is the interview process, but there's 109 pieces of evidence that was also submitted around my testimony. So those 3 hours were just a general.
Snippet, yeah.
That's right. And the commission, when I met with John the night before, explained that to me. Really nice, reasonable guy. Clearly, they were just looking for the facts, right? So some people in the YouTube alternative world don't understand. It's not a vlog. Like, I just can't go up there and start talking, right?
Yeah.
They're leading me in questions. This is why it was important to get my lawyer to allow a few leading questions for me. I was one of the few who had nobody on my side there.
Right.
So the constraints of a yes/no question and answer format was really difficult to get to the heart of what I wanted to get to. So do I feel like I got the message I wanted? Not really, because we tried to dumb it down to 3 simple points we need to get out there in testimony. We kind of kept trying to go back to it in my questions. So you notice they got frustrated with me a little bit.
Yeah, a little
right?
bit, yeah.
Because I'm trying to, like, I know where they're going, but I need the truth of the matter to get through.
Well, you have to answer the question the
That's
way
right.
you think it needs to be answered.
Agreed. So that part of it, yeah, I would say 50-50.
Okay.
There's so much more that I would like to expand on. And if I had standing, then I would have been able to lay out my whole case. But because I didn't, I was somewhat shackled in the process, and it was a little bit frustrating.
So you were boots cast on the ground because you had a broken foot,
Broken ankle.
Yeah.
So you were on the ground there, and one of the issues they'd be looking at is, did they exhaust all other alternative measures before they invoked the Emergency Act? That's one of the key questions, is it not?
Yeah, and they didn't try anything.
There were no tickets being given out for the first while.
That's right. The police were great. The police were fist bumping. The chief of police said on February 3rd that this requires a political solution. This is not a policing problem. But we had this issue where there were certain groups. We had 11 groups trying to take over the convoy, and I think, the legacy media, when they say anti-vax, it wasn't an anti-vax movement. However, asterisks, I do believe there was money from the U.S., from the anti-vax industry, that was trying to take advantage of the protest and, assert their narrative. But there were bunch of other groups trying to do the same thing.
Well, that's an interesting aspect, because you had official spokespeople, and you were one of them. Yeah. But there was more than just you. But then there were a bunch of other people who arrived to take advantage of
started having their own press conferences.
Right.
Yeah, so, it became a bit unwieldy.
So what was that like in terms of trying to contain who was being viewed as a spokesperson? Or, do you think it was even possible to prevent other interest groups from taking advantage of the situation?
It was frustrating because we woke up, every morning we started to get into a rhythm. Some new individual or group was trying to assert themselves, usually linked to some political party or a fringe political party, whatever, would call a press conference. And because I froze out the legacy media was looking for anybody. And They were stalking me in my hotel room, right? So those people went and took full advantage of that. So we would start every morning. We would find out X person has called a press conference. Okay, Tamara, who's calling the press conference today? She said, I don't know about a press conference. Look, find out who it is. We need to put an end to it. And so we finally got into rhythm. So every morning from like 6, 7 o'clock when I woke up till 11, 12 o'clock, we were trying to cancel whatever secret press conference with the legacy media that was established. It was infuriating, right? Because the media strategy that we were using worked really effectively, evidenced by the fact that it was all over the world, and they kept disrupting it. And those same people now are asserting themselves, well, we're not talking to legacy media. Like, well, during the convoy, you were chasing them. So, yeah, it was very frustrating. That's why we set up a board. We set up 3 command centers. We had one team that was working on security and safety to ensure that all the lanes were open for emergency vehicles. So that's where we had a police and a couple of paramedics that were working within that team. Then there was another team that was doing logistics if truckers needed problems or they needed fuel or any of that sort of stuff. And then my team was the media team and social media at the Sheraton Hotel. So we tried to do, like in aviation, cockpit resource management, division of labor. We tried to do that, but there's so many people that were so obsessed with money, including the media and politicians, were obsessed with the amount of money. And there were a lot of people that were just desperate for fame. And I don't know why. Like, I know some famous people. I know how difficult that life is. That's not something to aspire to. And for me, it was just work. It was wake up, okay, 6:30, you go get coffee for all of us. We're going to start interview this day, and then a press conference. Okay, let's deal with that. And then I just like was a machine, as many interviews as I could, because I was in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
I couldn't go out and talk to people on the ground. So like, that's how we operated.
There's an interesting aspect in terms of the actions that were taken. One, they cut off gas. They wanted trucks to leave, but they cut off gas. So I was unclear, how are the trucks going to leave if they have no gas?
Yeah.
But they cutting off the money. We've had situations like this in different cases where somebody who's accused of something but not convicted has all of their assets suddenly frozen.
Well, there's a couple aspects to it. So there's some types of offenses prior to a trial that people are charged with, where even if you don't have assets frozen, so typically in an organized crime type of case, even if it's human trafficking or drug related, you can have assets frozen ahead of time. That's one thing. But what's more insidious is when charged with certain offenses, notices have gone to banks because there were production orders. It's a type of search warrant that goes to a bank, and then the bank shuts down accounts of these people who are charged and have not been found guilty and may not be found guilty. So their accounts are shut down. Their mortgages are called in. Their lines of credit are called in. So they become, bank refugees and financial refugees, and there's nowhere to go because all that information is shared amongst the financial industry. So these people are f***ed. And very similarly, when they want to clamp down on these people, they are going after them financially, which is extremely egregious. This is where you talk about freedom of speech, our right to protest.
Well, it's almost like a right to life and liberty, because if you freeze all of somebody's assets, you can't even feed yourself.
Right, but
I couldn't get medicine for my ankle.
Yeah, and it's not so much as freezing; it's taking away. So you're co-opting the independent financial infrastructure to do the bidding to some extent of government policy, and for what we face in criminal law policy, which I find highly troubling, especially when you consider the presumption of innocence or what your constitutional rights are. That's something we don't hear talked about very much at all. They
actually have to bring applications in court in order to get access to some of those funds to pay for lawyer fees.
If it's frozen.
To pay for lawyer fees.
But you can't do anything about a bank shutting your line of credit down, your mortgage, or your actual accounts. You can do nothing about that. Mm-hmm. So if banks shut you down, that's their right, and that's the end of it.
And just to add to you may not know this story. I think you do. I think we told you this. When my accounts were frozen, and just so we're very clear, it was my bank accounts, corporate accounts, lines of credit, credit cards, everything was frozen. And in one case of one bank, I just no longer existed. I went to log in, my IDs were no longer active, apparently. So sometime in, I can't remember if it was April maybe.
I was trying to figure out if I could actually wire you money just so you could eat. And I was just like, if I wire you money, am I going to get my account's frozen? It was a scary time. Yeah. So there were these parliamentary commissions hearings that were called, right? The subcommittees among parliamentarians and stuff. And I was watching these, on the side, from the sidelines waiting, because what I did when my bank account was frozen is, I think I might have CC'd you on these emails. Yeah. I sent an email to my bank saying, why is my account frozen? Under what legislation, what law, whatever. And one bank responded. And people didn't understand. They thought I was attacking that bank. That was Scotiabank. I was trying to give them credit because at least they had the courtesy to respond. At least they wrote back. Yeah, right. Absolutely. And what they did is they inferred, if you read between the lines, that it was the government. Now, I held on to that. Why? Because during these hearings, Krista Friedland made the statement of, oh, well, we didn't force them. The banks did it on their own accord. Yeah. And that's I'm going to get you. Pulled out the email, called a journalist I know, said, let's do an article on my Substack. And the next thing I know is picked up by Daily Wire and then Zero Hedge and Jordan Peterson.
and put it out there, and then all of a sudden, and that narrative stopped really quickly. But that's the insidious nature of some of these people.
Yeah, that was a very bad narrative for the government to put out. I mean, this was not the banks acting on their own accord. This was.
Right.
I didn't have a chance to watch all of the testimony, but I did actually watch some of Trudeau's testimony, and in cross-examination, he denied calling protesters misogynists and racist.
I'm apparently a neo-Nazi Jew, but he seems to forget that.
Yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. There was just so much
At least
stuff
he
going
showed
on.
up.
Yeah,
I mean,
Doug is just as bad, right?
Yeah, I got to be honest. I'm no fan of our prime minister, but whether you like his politics or not, whether you like his answers or not, he showed up and he answered questions.
Agreed. And you can tell when he was prepped.
He was well prepped.
He was well prepped, yeah.
Because his messaging was on point for what he wanted to say. But he showed up and he answered questions.
That's right.
Wasn't there a fight for documents, though?
Redaction
there was.
of documents.
There were redactions. But he showed up to testify. And our premier, was successful on quashing the invitation to attend on the basis of parliamentary privilege. And he succeeded. And I think it was the right decision by the court. I'm not so sure it was the right politically, because it would be nice to hear. And if you're in support of what Justin Trudeau did at the time, our prime minister, then come out and say it. And I think the public needs the transparency. And maybe questions could be, there could be some negotiation, but at least he showed up.
Well, knowing what I know what was going on behind the scenes, and without getting into the details, that it's his administration that meddled with the convoy. That he couldn't have shown up. Like, you think his political career is bad right now. If he had to testify, it would have been nuked at that point. Right?
I think all politicians' careers right now are in trouble, given the state of a lot of things, including.
There's a couple of bills that one's been enacted now, and there's another one still on the table that I think are kind of related to this, the issues that came up with the convoy and your rights to protest and all this other stuff. And also this cutting down on freedom of speech and the ability for people to communicate with each other and do things like organize a convoy. So one of the ones that has been going on for a while, and it's not yet passed, it was Bill C-11, Online Streaming Act. This is a thing in Canada where they want to regulate under the, CRTC, I think it is, that they want to be able to regulate people who are online streaming, who are running YouTube channels, who are doing podcasts and things like that, that the content should be monitored and subject to rules that would apply to mainstream media and so on, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so serious, and this is important to talk about because when I went on YouTube just like a couple of days ago, YouTube actually noticed I was from Canada and gave me a little pop-up saying, do you know about Bill C-11? That's right. And they actually Google has put out some news content to inform people about it and how serious it is, because they're saying it will change our ability to suggest content to you. So when we think about like China and how if you go to China, you can't actually find things, on the internet in China because they have all these filters and so on. This is kind of the sense, some people are saying it's not that bad, but, if this kind of legislation goes through, it would dramatically affect, I think, the ability to organize something. Because
first of all, and from a producer standpoint, a media standpoint, who wants to get alternative messaging out, where you're offering another perspective. How do you feel about it?
When I came out of the commission, when I finished my testimony, I walked by, there was some media there, but my brain was tired. I just was not in the mood for questions. So I walked outside, and in front of the building, there was a woman with a pride flag and honk calling us terrorists. And she saw me, she knew who I was. Benji the terrorist. Benji is yelling at me, terrorist. So I pulled out my phone. I turned on my Instagram and I said, good morning, everybody, just finished. And I just want to make sure everybody understands what the Freedom Convoy was fighting for was her right to free speech as well as ours. She's probably a wonderful person. I think she's confused, but she should be allowed to say whatever she wants, just like we all should be. And I think that's very important. Now, I'm a free speech absolutist. I know you're not, but
I'm
you're
not.
close to I know.
I am.
But
I'm close. I'm closer.
I understand,
Yeah.
but I do understand your perspective. Like it's a complicated issue. But
It is.
I'm on the
because
absolutist
because in my opinion we're at a dangerous stage of our existence where we see certain type of speech to be really, really insidious. But I'll leave it at that.
side. I know, but for me, it's like my free speech allows me to challenge that, right? And that's
If you have the forum.
But now we all
Counter-speech, I
have the
think, is the
forum because we
solution.
have the internet.
But some people will
Everybody
pay
has the
attention to
forum.
us, and some people
Well,
won't.
we currently
and,
have the internet, but this is the
Well,
and this
the
is the
point.
concern
So,
now
yeah.
is what our ability will be to respond.
So from what I understand, C11 has already been massively picked apart in the Senate, and it was
they're being
sent
very
back.
cautious about it, is my understanding.
That's
Yeah.
right. So
Thankfully.
let's, not that I have a lot of faith in the political process, but let's do what we can and give them a chance.
Well,
And hopefully wisdom will prevail. But yeah, it's very, very concerning.
it relates back to what we were talking about earlier, where you actually disallowed the legacy media and you wanted to promote the lesser known
Alternative
media,
media,
the
yeah,
alternative
that's right.
media. So this bill would potentially prevent that from happening, that being effective, right?
That's right.
Alternative media would be highly scrutinized. A podcast like ours could be highly scrutinized.
Well,
But you know,
everybody would use VPNs like China. But that's the problem. That's what we're becoming.
And one of the comments
know-
I saw from one of the members of parliament was, well, we're not trying to censor cat videos. But
Because
that's a long way
Diana
to go.
Diana
who gives
Davison,
a
video
that?
producer.
who gives a shit? But you know what's interesting, and when you say it, because in Canada, it goes through Parliament, then goes to our Senate. And the Senate is, from what little I've been able to read and you're reading, is trying to really deal with it.
Thankfully, they're scrutinizing it very closely.
But what's unique about our Senate? It's not elected.
That's right.
These are partisan appointments of people who are not politicians, not lawyers, they could be journalists, they could be any number of people from any walk of life, and they get appointed to the Senate for, I forgot whatever the term is now. It used to be life, but I don't know if it's changed. And there was this move to abolish the Senate because it's not elected. Well, you know what? Don't ask what you don't want. I, in some respects, frankly, having a check that's non-allegiant to a voting segment may actually do us some help in these cases.
Well, I find it really striking.
Isn't that odd? When we talk about democracy
It's
and
weird.
liberty.
But I find it
Anyways.
very striking that Google and YouTube finds this so scary that they're actually flagging it and putting
Well,
pop-ups.
they make big bucks off of YouTube and
That's their business
Google.
model,
This
yeah.
is their business
so
model.
they have like a little blog about it. But the other one is, so one of our transcriptionists actually sent me a little text message
Shout
saying,
out to Helena.
Elena, she's great. Bill C-100, Keeping Ontario Open for Business
Oh,
Act
God.
2022. You know what I'm talking about. So they immediately
complete
made sure you
opposite.
couldn't do another convoy.
It's basically taking the emergency power. Because remember, everybody complains about Justin Trudeau, and this is why the Conservatives get angry at me, because they behave like a cult. Doug Ford enacted the Emergency Measures Acts on the provincial level 2 days before Justin Trudeau. And now he's introduced Bill C-11, which is those emergency powers permanently.
100. C-100.
Sorry, C-100, permanently. And I try to explain to my friends on that side of the aisle, you're not going to like that when you have a Justin Trudeau type figure on the provincial level. How do you think that's going to play out? And it's just, everybody just says
Well,
nothing.
it may be enacted. We'll see if it's challenged, because that may
That's right.
succeed as well as he succeeded in trying to deal with imposing a contract on teaching assistants. So
But for now, for people who want to get the deep inside story on what happened on the ground in
honking for freedom.
Honking for Freedom,
Benjamin
Dichter.
Honkingforfreedom.com, and leave a review. And leave a review for this podcast too. Like, share, and subscribe.
And hit notifications.
Thank
Hit
you, BJ, for
notification.
coming.
All right, brother.
This
Thank
was
you very much.
Wonderful.